ValuJet Flight 592 is preparing to take off from Florida's Miami International Airport. The aircraft is a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, registered N904VJ. The aircraft is 27 years old, previously owned by Delta Airlines. Its first flight was on April 18, 1969, and was delivered to Delta on May 27, 1969. The aircraft flew for Delta until the end of 1992, when it was retired and sold back to McDonnell Douglas. Then, the manufacturer sold it to ValuJet in 1993. ValuJet is an extremely cost-cutting airline who is known for their aggressive cost-cutting measures, such as leaving things unmaintained and stuff like that. This aircraft had a previous history of problems, as there had been 2 aborted takeoffs, 8 emergency landings, engine and pressurization issues, and stuff like that. There are 105 passengers and 5 crew members on board. On board the flight deck is Captain Candlin Kubek, age 35. She has logged 8,928 flight hours and 2,116 on the DC-9. Beside her is First Officer Richard Hazen, 52. He has logged 11,800 flight hours, with 2,148 of them on the DC-9. At 2:04 p.m., the aircraft begins. At about 2 o'clock, the aircraft begins its takeoff roll down the runway. At about 2:04 p.m., the aircraft lifts off from Miami International Airport. In the cargo hold are boxes labeled as empty oxygen canisters, but in reality, in those boxes are dangerous oxygen generators, which still have oxygen in them. Now, the way an oxygen generator works is it is very flammable because it produces oxygen, but also gets extremely hot when it produces oxygen. So basically, if it catches on fire, it has its own oxygen source. Now, this particular plane has a Class D cargo hold, which is meant to depressurize if there's fire and seal away the oxygen from the flames. And we're getting ahead of ourselves here. At 2:10 p.m., the passengers start to smell smoke. At the same time, the pilots hear a loud bang, and they start to lose electrical power in the aircraft. Seconds later, a flight attendant enters the cockpit and tells the flight crew of a fire in the passenger cabin. And also, the passengers shouting, "Fire! Fire!" is heard on the cockpit voice recorder. The flight training manual says that the cockpit door should not be opened when smoke or harmful gases might be present in the cabin, but the intercom wasn't functional because of ValuJet's cost-cutting measures, and resulted in the flight attendant having to come into the cockpit to tell them about it. Also, the autopilot was not operable for this flight, so the pilots were having to fly by hand. The pilots asked air traffic control for a return to Miami due to the increasing smoke in cockpit and cabin, and were given instructions for a return to the airport. A minute later, the first officer requests the nearest airport available, and the captain begins to turn the plane left
2,500
in preparation for a return to Miami. I'm sorry about this, that I had to go into the menu, but that's just to show you guys the failures that would be happening here. So basically the aircraft is losing electrical power.
Being great.
Eventually, the captain eventually tries to throttle back.
Overspeed. 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 Overspeed.
No, that didn't happen. But anyways, eventually the captain begins to throttle back the engines to slow down for an approach to Miami. But as she does so,
Being great. Being great.
only the left engine responds to her command to throttle back. Only the right engine responds to the command to throttle back due to the fire burning through critical systems. And also the controls are now being burned through as well. So as a result, the aircraft begins to bank right. And she has no way of controlling it as the controls are being burned through. Now, by now, it's not only smoke, but everything is ablaze in the cargo hold. The fire is beginning to burn through the floor. The passengers are trying to move farther forward in the aircraft. And no one knows for sure, but it's thought that around this point, both pilots lose consciousness due to the smoke.
Being great. Being great.
The aircraft begins turning right due to having
Overspeed.
Being great.
Overspeed.
Due to
Being great.
having no controls, the aircraft continues to roll over until finally the aircraft slams into the Everglades, inverted and banking right. The investigation that followed uncovered the fact that ValuJet's labor contractor, SaberTech, had incorrectly handled and loaded oxygen generators, as this aircraft had recently had its oxygen generators replaced. Now, oxygen generators are little canisters of oxygen that generate oxygen above the seats in a commercial airliner, and if the cabin ever got depressurized for some reason, the oxygen masks would come down, and those generators would create oxygen for about, 10 to 20 minutes. But the thing with these generators is they get so hot that there has to be a heat shield there to keep them from starting a fire. And so basically, when they remove the generators, there's lanyards that are usually attached to oxygen masks, cords, that when the oxygen mask drops down, the generator starts working. So basically what SaberTech did is they cut off or taped the lanyards to the side of the canister and then loaded them in boxes into the cargo hold of the ValuJet plane. So either as the aircraft was taxiing or as it was taking off, those generators got jostled and activated. And usually what the cargo hold of this plane was a Class D cargo hold, meaning that to stop the fire, it starved the fire of oxygen by depressurizing the hold. But that didn't help in this instance because the stuff that was burning was creating its own oxygen. And also, to make matters worse, there was an aircraft tire being carried in the cargo hold. So that was the loud bang the pilots heard, and it, of course, released more oxygen into the air. So that made matters worse. And then the fire just started burning through everything and eventually disabled the controls to the right engine and all the controls. So the pilot couldn't correct the right bank from only the left engine being on. So SaberTech was fined heavily for this incident, as was ValuJet for not supervising them properly. And couple years later, in 1997, ValuJet ceased operations and merged into AirTran Airways. It only operated from 1993 to 1997. So it was a very short-lived airline, but they cut costs way too heavily. So everyone was killed on the aircraft as it slammed straight into the Everglades. So a lesson that can be learned from this is make sure and supervise your work contractor and don't cut costs as heavily as ValuJet did.